Night falls differently in the Florida Everglades. The air turns heavy and wet, and the swamp seems to breathe. Water moves slowly between mangroves, insects hum like distant machinery, and the dark stretches deeper than most people expect. Everyone knows the swamps are dangerous. Everyone knows about the alligators. But locals often say the same thing in quiet voices. Florida swamps hide more than alligators. That sentence has become part of a Florida swamp horror story repeated by fishermen, hunters, and airboat guides who spend enough time in the Everglades to notice when something doesn't belong. During the day, the swamps look almost peaceful. Wide stretches of water reflect the sky, and birds move through the reeds with graceful patience. Tourists ride airboats through the wetlands, while guides point out wildlife and laugh about swamp myths. But once the sun drops behind the cypress trees, the entire Everglades feels different. The air thickens, the sounds grow sharper, and the shadows move in ways that don't match the wind. One of the most disturbing Everglades mystery stories started with a wildlife photographer named Daniel Reyes. He had traveled across the United States documenting remote environments, and creepy places in Florida had always fascinated him. The Florida urban legend about haunted swamps Florida residents whispered about sounded perfect for his next project. Daniel arrived in a small town near the southern edge of the Everglades. The locals were friendly but cautious when he mentioned the swamps after dark. A bartender in a dim roadside restaurant told him something that sounded less like a joke and more like a warning. "Stay out of the water after midnight," the man said. "Not because of gators." Daniel smiled, assuming it was just another piece of swamp folklore. American swamp horror stories often grow out of exaggeration and fear of the unknown. Still, he packed extra batteries, night vision lenses, and a portable recorder. He planned to capture sounds and images from deep in the wetlands. At sunset the following evening, he took a narrow trail leading into the mangroves. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The usual swamp sounds, frogs, birds, insects, started fading until the only noise left was water gently shifting around tree roots. By midnight, Daniel had reached a small clearing surrounded by shallow water and tall reeds. It felt isolated, perfect for documenting a paranormal swamp USA legend if one existed. He set up his camera on a tripod and began recording the dark waterline. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Then he heard footsteps. At first he assumed it was another animal moving through the marsh. The Everglades are full of wildlife after all. But the sound didn't match anything he knew. It was slow and deliberate, as if something heavy was walking through water but trying not to make noise. Daniel pointed his camera toward the reeds. The movement stopped instantly. He waited. Silence. Then the water behind him shifted. He turned quickly, shining his flashlight across the swamp. The beam skimmed over floating plants and muddy banks before stopping on something strange. Just for a second, the light reflected off what looked like eyes above the waterline. Not yellow like an alligator, white. Human white. He blinked, and the reflection vanished. Daniel laughed nervously to himself. Florida swamp horror stories can play tricks on your mind when you're alone in darkness. He continued filming, focusing on the still water ahead. The footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, slow splashes. Careful movement through the swamp. Daniel adjusted the zoom on his camera, hoping to capture whatever animal was approaching. The reeds parted slightly. For a moment he thought he saw a person standing in the water. But no one could stand there. The swamp in that area was waist deep and thick with roots. The figure didn't move like a person either. It remained perfectly still, half hidden by mangroves. The only thing Daniel could clearly see were the eyes again. Wide, reflective, watching. The Florida swamp horror story that locals talked about suddenly didn't feel like a joke anymore. Daniel slowly stepped backward toward the path he had taken earlier. The figure in the water didn't follow. It remained frozen between the reeds. Then another pair of eyes appeared behind it. Then another. The swamp wasn't empty. Shapes began emerging from the water all around the clearing. Some were barely visible. Others stood taller than the reeds. Their outlines were distorted by the darkness, but one detail was unmistakable. They were standing in water that should have swallowed them. The American swamp horror that fishermen whispered about wasn't about monsters attacking people. It was about something older living deep in the Everglades. Something that watched quietly until humans wandered too far into its territory. Daniel grabbed his camera and started backing toward the trail faster. The shapes in the swamp moved with him, not chasing, just keeping distance. As he walked, he noticed something terrifying. None of the figures were making splash sounds anymore. The water around them stayed perfectly still, as if they weren't touching the swamp floor at all. Daniel reached the narrow trail and started running. Branches scraped against his arms, and insects buzzed in his ears. Behind him, he could hear the slow movement again. Not footsteps now, sliding, like something gliding through shallow water. When he finally reached his truck, parked near the road, he slammed the door and locked it. His chest heaved as he tried to calm down. The swamp behind him looked empty again. No shapes, no eyes, just dark water and mangroves. Daniel drove back to town immediately. The bartender was still working when he arrived just before dawn. Daniel placed the camera on the counter and described everything he had seen. The man listened quietly, then nodded as if the story confirmed something he already knew. "That's why we don't go out there at night," he said. Daniel reviewed the footage on his laptop later that morning. At first it looked normal. Water, reeds, darkness. Then the shapes appeared. Not clearly, but enough to make the story real. Several tall figures could be seen standing in the swamp behind the clearing. Their outlines were long and thin, and their eyes reflected the infrared light of the camera. The most disturbing part came near the end of the recording. As Daniel backed toward the trail, one of the figures stepped forward. For a brief moment, the camera caught its reflection on the water. It wasn't an animal. It looked almost human. Almost. The footage circulated quietly among paranormal researchers and fans of American urban legend stories. Many dismissed it as edited or misunderstood wildlife. Others claimed it was proof that the haunted swamps Florida locals feared were hiding something unknown. But Daniel noticed something else after leaving the Everglades. For weeks afterward, he woke up in the middle of the night hearing water dripping somewhere in his apartment. Slow, rhythmic, like swamp water falling from mangrove roots. One night, he opened his window after hearing the sound again. Across the street, under a streetlight, something stood motionless on the sidewalk. Too tall, too thin, and its eyes reflected the light exactly the same way they had in the swamp. Daniel closed the window immediately, because the truth behind the Everglades mystery might be worse than any legend. Maybe the Florida swamps don't just hide creatures. Maybe they're watching the people who come in, waiting to see who leaves, and who might follow the water back home.